August 1945, Guam, late afternoon. Heat pressed down in a white glare that bounced off coral dust and tent canvas. The air sharp with diesel from a humming generator and the tannic bite of creosote posts. Behind 2 runs of concertina wire, men in sun-faded khaki and sweat-streaked field caps watched American cooks tilt steel pitchers over chipped enamel cups. The liquid was pale, cloudy, almost milky against the metal rims. Lemon water, some mouthed, baffled. Only weeks earlier, they had crawled through the black mouths of caves on Tinian and Okinawa, training their ears to the slide of an M1 bolt and the stutter of a Browning, certain that capture meant shame worse than death. Now a sergeant with rolled sleeves and salt rings on his web belt, ladled from a canvas, Lyster bag, chlorinated water mixed with lemon powder from K-ration envelopes, and set cups on a plank table as if serving farmhands. A few prisoners snorted and turned away, calling it a trick. Others stared with dry tongues, counting the 5-gallon jerry cans lined in rows like ammunition, the color of sunshine. An hour passed, then another. The breeze fell away, and cicadas thickened the silence until thirst spoke louder than pride. One man stepped forward first, palms out, cup trembling when the liquid met metal. The tartness struck like a slap, acid, clean, threaded with a sweetness he had not tasted since before Saipan fell in June 1944. Salt stung the cracks in his lips. Sweat cooled on his scalp. The world sharpened. Around him, shoulders sagged. Cups lifted. Guards refilled without comment. The routine of a field kitchen moving with the same economy as a gun crew. No speech, no ceremony, only sugar, water, and a sour bite that announced an unexpected fact. The enemy could kill with fire and still spare a small mercy. That bewilderment, first swallowed, then savored, would stretch past the wire, and to understand why it shocked them so completely, we must step back into the long years of total war and the lessons that had taught them what surrender was supposed to mean. December 1941, Tokyo, the night before war. Snow fell in faint flakes over the Imperial Palace moat, and in a small lamplit office within the War Ministry, a clerk typed the words that would become doctrine. Those who fall into enemy hands are no longer Japanese. The directive, signed under the authority of Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, codified an ancient belief for a modern empire. It was the written echo of Bushido, the samurai's way of death transposed onto the machinery of total war. In every barracks from Manchuria to Micronesia, recruits memorized the same creed. Loyalty unto death, surrender unthinkable. The notion of capture was not merely disgrace, it was spiritual extinction. Even before the war reached its blood-soaked crescendo, the Imperial Japanese Army had built a psychological fortress around its soldiers, sealing them against the idea of mercy. By 1942, that creed burned in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the reefs of Tarawa. U.S. Marines advancing through mangrove and coral found corpses clutching grenades, their pins already pulled. Of the 1,500 defenders of Tarawa's Betio Island, only 17 were taken alive. The rest had obeyed Bushido's final command. In Saipan, July 1944, it metastasized into tragedy. Hundreds of civilians, herded by propaganda and fear, leapt from Marpy Point's cliffs, believing capture meant torture. For the Americans who watched horrified, it was proof that this enemy would rather die en masse than surrender as individuals. War reports to Washington spoke of total fanaticism, and medical officers noted the absence of wounded prisoners, a phenomenon unseen in Europe. Yet, beneath the ashes of that devotion, cracks began to form. As Japan's perimeter collapsed, Saipan lost, the Philippines invaded, the Navy shattered at Leyte Gulf, whole garrisons were cut off. On Guam and Tinian in mid-1945, starving men crawled from limestone caves waving white rags torn from undershirts. They came not out of conversion, but exhaustion. Their rifles rusted, rations gone, discipline dissolved into survival. For them, surrender was no longer a moral failure. It was the last physical act left possible. They would soon meet an American system defined not by vengeance but by procedure, where the captor's weapon was not cruelty, but order. That meeting between men who believed they had forfeited their humanity, and a military that insisted on treating them as human, would redefine the meaning of surrender in the Pacific. July 1945, northern Guam, the island still, carried the scent of gunpowder and crushed palm. But construction hammers now echoed louder than rifles. Bulldozers flattened coral ridges where only months earlier mortars had dug their scars. Under the direction of the 305th Military Police Escort Guard Company, a new kind of battlefield took shape, one of fences, ledgers, and order. Camp Churro, the largest of Guam's prisoner-of-war compounds, rose from the red earth in perfect geometry. Quonset huts arched like tin ribs over the soil, each row marked by whitewashed numbers. Between them ran paths lined with barbed mesh and wooden posts bleached by the sun. Inside the perimeter, the U.S. Army built not punishment but procedure, a machine calibrated to the Geneva Convention's exact measurements. Each section of the camp followed function over cruelty. Officers were quartered apart from enlisted men. The infirmary, stocked with sulfur drugs and bandages, treated malaria, beriberi, and festering coral wounds with clinical regularity. A posted schedule dictated every movement, roll call, inspection, meals. Even the latrines were measured by regulation, one seat for every 20 prisoners. To men who had lived by the chaos of island warfare, the sight of this bureaucracy felt alien, even mocking. The Americans make rules for everything, one guard noted in his logbook, even for kindness. Rations, too, came with precision, 3,200 calories per man, per day. Cooked rice when available, army beans and cabbage when not. The prisoners could scarcely believe the figures. They had eaten tree bark weeks earlier in Tinian's hills. U.S. cooks began mixing white rice with field rations, adding canned fruit or powdered milk. The effect was subtle but profound. Food became the first language of civilization. For men conditioned to expect degradation, the smallest gestures, soap passed through wire, a bucket of cold water, a slice of pineapple, signaled a different kind of victory. The war of annihilation was over. The war of rehumanization had begun. Within this framework of structure and supply, something unexpected would soon emerge, a bridge of flavor, the first taste of lemonade. August 1945, Anderson Field Depot, Guam. The smell of diesel and salt water clung to everything, wooden crates, canvas sacks, even the khaki shirts of the quartermasters, unloading ships from San Francisco. From these cargo holds came more than ammunition and canned beef. There were boxes stamped Quartermaster Corps. Synthetic beverage mix Type A. Inside each were brown packets of fine yellow powder, crystalline and sharp, the Army's chemical substitute for a lemon grove. Labeled lemonade synthetic, it was never meant for diplomacy. It was science-serving logistics. Since 1943, the U.S. Army had issued the mix to every Pacific base to keep soldiers hydrated and scurvy-free, each gallon requiring precisely 1.5 ounces of powder for 8 quarts of water. Vitamin C, citric acid, sugar, and sodium blended to make a drink that was easy to ship, harder to spoil. And, at least for Americans, comfortingly ordinary. For the Japanese prisoners behind the wire of Camp Churro, that ordinariness was terrifying. The guards' offer of a pale, opaque liquid in battered cups looked like a trick of defeat. They whispered the word doku, poison. The flavor itself, when finally tasted, seemed wrong to their tongues, sharp as vinegar, sweet as medicine. Japan's wartime rations had trained their palates for salt and bitterness, dried fish, pickled plum, barley gruel, not this foreign alchemy of sour and sweet. To drink it was to accept not only the enemy's water, but his world. American medical officers, citing field manuals and physiological charts, overruled superstition. Hydration saves manpower, one captain noted dryly, and so the routine began. At first, guards poured without eye contact. Prisoners accepted without gratitude, but thirst in Guam's blistering humidity dissolved even pride hardened by Bushido. By the third day, canteens rattled empty before noon. The same men who had once buried grenades for suicide now queued silently for refills, learning without ceremony that survival had its own kind of honor. The lemonade, synthetic and simple, had done what speeches never could. It made surrender taste human. What began as powdered sugar water would soon evolve into something far deeper, a quiet bridge between captor and captive, reshaping the hearts of both. August 15, 1945, Guam. The morning broke heavy with humidity, the jungle steaming under a pale sky that shimmered with heat. From the ridges above Yigo, shapes began to move. skeletal men in ragged uniforms, their helmets dented, their rifles slung upside down. Word had reached even the most isolated redoubts. The Emperor had spoken. Japan had surrendered. For the first time in years, silence replaced gunfire. By noon, nearly 1,500 soldiers stumbled into the open, arms raised in exhaustion more than defiance. Some still bowed, others stared straight ahead, hollow-eyed. The air carried the smell of rot and damp earth, the legacy of too many weeks spent in caves surviving on rainwater and roots. American Marines waited at the perimeter, rifles slung, but muzzles low. No shots came. Instead, a medic stepped forward with a tin pail and bandages. Another offered cigarettes, and from a field kitchen came the unmistakable rattle of metal cups. "Lemonade," a corporal called out as if it were any other day on base. The liquid gleamed pale in the tropical light, almost mocking in its normalcy. To the Japanese, it was absurd. A battlefield turned canteen. One man hesitated, then drank. The sour shock of sugar and acid made his eyes water. He coughed, laughed once, and drank again. Sergeant James Hollister, of the 3rd Marine Division, wrote later, "They laughed at the yellow drink, then asked for more." For men who had sworn never to taste defeat, that small indulgence was an earthquake. Some drank greedily, others wept quietly behind their tin cups. The Marines watching began to see not soldiers but survivors. Interpreters noted the shift. Guards started using names instead of numbers. Prisoners responded with nods instead of silence. The camp that afternoon felt less like a cage and more like uneasy coexistence. That fragile truce, born not from orders but from flavor, would soon attract the notice of American officers who saw in it something valuable. Proof that humanity could be rationed, one cup at a time. September 1945, Camp Churro, Guam. The air hung thick with heat and the smell of canvas, sweat, and disinfectant. Within the barbed boundaries of the camp, something curious was unfolding. An experiment in humanity disguised as routine hydration. Army psychiatrists attached to the 6th Service Command had arrived to study the mental state of surrendered Japanese troops, men shaped by years of indoctrination and stripped of identity by defeat. What they found startled them. The sharpest weapon for reconditioning was not lecture or leaflet, but lemonade. The powdered drink, cheap, bright, and plentiful, was changing behavior faster than any speech on democracy ever could. It began with observation. The first to approach for refills were the younger soldiers, those too exhausted to cling to ritual. Then came the veterans, former sergeants and corporals whose loyalty had once been granite. They hesitated, then joined the queue. The drink's odd blend of sweet and sour, initially rejected as enemy contamination, had become strangely comforting. Voluntary approach behavior, one report called it, the first sign of trust. Men who had once considered their captors subhuman were now laughing over the drink that had once symbolized deceit. It was not the flavor that mattered, but the act. Accepting sustenance from the hands of the enemy and surviving it. Camp commandants, recognizing the pattern, institutionalized it. Shared refreshment breaks were scheduled before work details or questioning sessions. Guards poured the liquid deliberately, without condescension. The consistency, same hour, same temperature, same ration, bred predictability, which in turn bred calm. By September, the medical officer's ledger recorded a peculiar statistic. Average lemonade consumption had risen to 1.7 quarts per man per day. Hydration had become habit. Habit had become trust. What began as chemistry had turned into psychology, the breakdown of an ideology through the simple act of quenching thirst. The irony was that this agent of peace, this powder of sugar and acid, had been born in the industrial furnaces of total war. Behind every tin cup filled in the blazing heat of Guam stood a machinery of war so vast it blurred the line between combat and commerce. By 1944, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Depot in Oakland was operating around the clock. Its conveyors churning out powdered beverage base by the ton, over 40 million pounds in the last 2 years of the war. Each brown sack of lemonade, synthetic type A, represented a triumph of chemistry and logistics. Beet sugar refined in Illinois, citric acid synthesized in Baltimore, flavor compounds mixed and dehydrated in sealed Chicago vats. The result was a product that, once shipped, weighed only a fraction of its liquid equivalent. Dehydration had become strategy, reducing cargo mass by 85% and freeing Liberty ships to carry more food, munitions and medicine across the Pacific. In cavernous warehouses along the west coast, the process resembled an assembly line for endurance. Labels read Class II Subsistence, Pacific Theater. From these depots, crates moved by rail to San Francisco piers, stacked into the bellies of freighters bound for Pearl Harbor, Ulithi, and Guam. Each packet's journey spanned nearly 7,000 miles before it reached a mess tent or field kitchen where boiling water and discipline turned powder into sustenance. It was an invisible supply chain of staggering precision, one that kept soldiers, sailors, and prisoners alike alive in climates that could kill a man faster than a bullet. To the Japanese prisoners who lifted those dented cups, that network was incomprehensible. They saw only the final act, abundance without end. Where Japan's merchant fleet lay rusting at the bottom of the Pacific, America's armada of logistics sailed on, delivering sweetness where starvation once reigned. Every swallow of lemonade was a quiet revelation, the flavor of an empire that had mastered not conquest, but continuity. The same industrial miracle that had armed the world was now feeding its former enemies, turning mass production into a form of mercy. September 1945. Camp Churro settled into rhythm. The clang of the morning bell, the rattle of tin trays, the low murmur of men in two languages. What had begun as stunned compliance was turning into something quieter, deeper, adaptation. Within weeks, the lemonade that once drew suspicion became part of the camp's pulse. Cooks ladled it into canteens with practiced efficiency, and prisoners no longer hesitated to drink. Conversations began to replace the long silences that had once defined the compound. A Marine corporal noted in his log, "They line up like our own boys now, orderly, polite, grateful." Across the wire, small habits changed first. Prisoners folded their blankets after inspection, polished boots no one would see, and queued neatly for meals. They began to copy the guard's gestures, the wave of a hand, the casual salute, even the awkward good morning. For men trained to believe that the enemy was a beast in human form, the discovery of shared routine was destabilizing. In captured diaries later translated by intelligence officers, phrases appeared like quiet confessions. The enemy is human and strange. The distance between captor and captive shrank not through doctrine, but through ritual, the offering of food, the exchange of tools, the daily pouring of lemonade. For the Americans, it was confirmation that civility worked where coercion failed. The psychiatrists who had once charted fear now observed empathy taking its place. For the Japanese soldiers, defeat was being rewritten. There was no emperor's wrath, no torture chambers, only the hum of generators, the smell of cooked rice, and the tart sweet taste that marked the end of war. Historians would later call these fragile exchanges micro-truces, moments where compassion did what ideology could not, prove that mercy, too, had discipline. Yet not all within the fences could accept that revelation. For some, each sip of lemonade was a quiet act of treason. Late August 1945, inside Camp Churro's wire, obedience still fought its final war. Among the gaunt figures in torn uniforms were men who refused to bend, officers whose faces had been carved by years of indoctrination. To them, defeat was not the end of battle, but its deepest humiliation. They gathered their subordinates in rows and declared that the emperor's soldiers would not accept food from barbarians, nor touch the yellow liquid of deception the guards poured into metal cups. One lieutenant on Guam, his sword confiscated but his authority intact, ordered punishment for any man caught drinking the enemy's concoction. The command was simple, absolute, and doomed. The Pacific heat became its own insurgent. Under the merciless sun, thirst stripped away ideology faster than argument ever could. Guards noted that the disciplinary reports dwindled within days. The men who once enforced silence began to drink in secret after dusk, filling mess tins at the water drums when the guards turned away. Their subordinates followed, first furtively, then openly. "Lemonade loyalty," the American MPs joked, meaning men who had surrendered not only their weapons but their pride. It was a phrase born half in humor, half in observation. The sweet sour drink had become a gauge of surrender more precise than any interrogation. By September, resistance had evaporated. Even the diehards, faces drawn and lips cracked, queued in the open. The lieutenant himself was seen one evening tipping a cup against his mouth, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though daring the emperor to strike him down. Nothing happened. The war gods stayed silent. What remained was survival, unheroic, human, undeniable. In the heat of Guam, honor redefined itself not through death, but endurance. As that surrender settled into routine, the American system shifted focus, from mercy to management, from care to classification, preparing thousands for the long road home. By November 1945, the Pacific had become an archipelago of order. Across Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines, more than 35,000 Japanese prisoners were living under the watchful precision of U.S. Army regulation. Each man passed through a process designed not for vengeance, but verification. Name, number, fingerprint, photograph. Medics recorded height and blood type, treated ulcers, malaria, and malnutrition, and filed the results into ledgers stamped War Department, Prisoner of War Division. What could have been punishment was instead procedure, a bureaucracy of humanity. The men who once vanished into caves to die were now catalogued into life again. At Camp Churro, the rhythm was almost domestic. 3 meals a day at set intervals, rice when available, beans and cabbage when not. Lemonade remained in the ration schedule, listed without sentiment as beverage synthetic, type A 8 Oz per man. Yet officers noted in their weekly reports that it had practical and psychological worth, reducing heat casualties and easing temperaments. Morale improves markedly with flavored hydration, one medical officer wrote, as if recording a discovery rather than a kindness. The act of pouring and sharing the pale drink had become so ordinary that it no longer felt symbolic, proof perhaps that peace had begun to take root. Around the compounds, routine evolved into civility. Prisoners worked in carpentry sheds, tended gardens, or cleared brush for new barracks. American guards, once suspicious and distant, began to teach hygiene, tool use, and even baseball. The same gloves that had thrown grenades now caught softballs under the Pacific sun. Each form signed, each wound treated, chipped away at the myth of savagery on both sides. The war's end had not merely disarmed an enemy, it had reordered him. And as ships gathered for repatriation, these temporary camps began to resemble something unexpected. Classrooms where the defeated learned not surrender, but peace. Spring 1946, Apra Harbor, Guam. The sea shimmered like glass under the morning sun as Liberty ships lined the docks, their hulls stacked with crates marked return personnel, Japanese POWs. After months in camps, the prisoners, now organized, shaven and dressed in plain khaki, boarded in silence. The war was over, yet its shadow clung to them. Each man carried a canvas kit, a numbered tag, and one ration for the voyage, powdered lemonade, 1 gallon per day per head. It was an odd souvenir of captivity, a drink that had outlasted guns and flags. On the manifests it appeared as lemonade synthetic type A, the same mixture that had turned suspicion into survival beneath Guam's sun. The crossing took weeks. On deck, men watched the horizon unroll, blue and endless. Some spoke quietly of America, the land that had bombed them into surrender, yet had fed them after defeat. They marveled at its abundance, its strange courtesy. One soldier later told an interviewer in Tokyo, "They gave us sweet water when they could have given us death." The words carried no bitterness, only disbelief. For many, the lemonade's sharp taste had fused with memory itself, the flavor of captivity, of shame, and of unexpected mercy. When the ships anchored off Yokohama and Uraga, home no longer resembled what they remembered. Cities lay in ash, temples gutted, families scattered. The men who stepped ashore were thinner, quieter, changed. They had left Japan as warriors and returned as witnesses to an enemy who had fought with machines but conquered with order. Some spoke of guards who shared cigarettes, medics who treated wounds, and that pale drink that kept them alive. Their stories drifted through a country rebuilding itself, softening the myth of Allied cruelty that wartime propaganda had sown. To Americans, lemonade had been a ration. To the returning soldiers, it had become something larger, a symbol of paradoxical mercy in a world learning how to live again. In the vast arithmetic of World War II, measured in divisions, tonnage and dead, the story of lemonade seems too small to matter. It was only powder and water, the byproduct of an industrial empire that had learned to feed millions. Yet in the prisoner of war camps of Guam and Okinawa, it became something extraordinary. The taste of humanity enduring through ruin. For men raised to believe that surrender erased their souls, each sip marked rebellion against despair. The bitterness of defeat met the sweetness of life, and together they remade meaning. When the guns fell silent, it wasn't generals or flags that taught the first lessons of peace, it was the small mercies of captors who refused to hate. A paper cup, a refill offered without mockery, a routine that replaced cruelty with order. These gestures stitched a fragile civility across the wreckage of ideology. In later years, when survivors told their children about captivity, they did not recall humiliation or vengeance. They remembered a strange yellow drink that tasted like sunlight, handed to them by men they had been told were monsters. History tends to honor victory with monuments and treaties, but its quietest triumphs often dissolve into memory's margins. This one endures because it redefined what conquest could mean. The Japanese prisoners who once mocked lemonade and later drank it by the gallon discovered that compassion, not power, was the final weapon of war. Peace, they learned, is not declared. It is poured one act of decency at a time.